All right, just to be conscious of everybody's time, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I am Stacy Bloom Rexrode, an artist and curator of exhibitions at the city of Raleigh, and I'd like to welcome you all to our Collection of Changes panel discussion. We are joined tonight by our moderator, Michael Williams, founder of the Black on Black Project. And our panel is Linda Dougherty, Chief Curator and Curator of Contemporary Art at North Carolina Museum of Art, Jonell Logan, Vice President and Creative Director at the McCall Center for Art and Innovation, Marshall Price, Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Museum of Art, Lakeshia Reid, Artist and owner of the 311 Gallery in Raleigh, and William Paul Thomas, Artist and Independent Curator and Educator. And both Lakeshia and Will's work are included in the exhibition at the Block Gallery. And I would like to go ahead and share my screen here for a second. And this is where my tech savvy, let's see if I can get it to work here. Bear with me. All right. And let's see, present. Can everybody see that all right? Okay. And I thought I would just go ahead and start with a brief slideshow of the current exhibition, which inspired the idea for this discussion. So I've been working on improving equity and inclusion within our exhibition and collection since starting this position in 2015. It was around 2018, 2019, when we started to make the purchases for the collection currently being exhibited. I've worked with Mike Williams, excuse me, on a couple of different projects, and it was the exhibition I Feel Like That with works by artist Telvin Wallace that confirmed the importance of this type of work. And the exhibition was made up of portraits of people of color struggling with mental health issues. It was when I was installing the work when an employee that works in the building came up to me and said, "Stace, this is the first time I've ever felt like artwork represents me and I can actually relate to it." And I think that was kind of my aha moment. And I knew the work we were trying to do was important and needed to be really elevated in order to serve the community better. And I started to review our collection database and realized we weren't selecting works that really match the demographics of our community. And when I approached the City of Raleigh Arts Commission about prioritizing equity and inclusion in our purchases, they fully embraced the idea of it being our mission. And this exhibition includes works we've added to the collection over the last 3 years and includes works by Jasmine Best, Barbara Campbell Thomas, Aaliyah El-Bermani, I knew I was going to mess up her name, I apologize, Clarence Hayward, Janet Link, Beverly McKeever, Carmen Neely, Alberto Ortega, Lakeshia, and Robin Scott, Sabotage, Will, Telvin Wallace, Stephanie J. Woods, and Antoine Williams. And so really through this exhibition and different conversations that I've been having with many others, I was just curious to learn how others were thinking about and addressing this, and reached out to Mike to lead the discussion. And I'd like to invite attendees to post questions and comments in the chat, so we might be able to add those to the discussion. And with that, I'd like to turn everything over to the moderator, Mike Williams, and we will start our discussion. And let me stop sharing my screen here.
All right, Stacy, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who are at home watching. And thank you to the folks who are gonna be in this discussion with us tonight. The summer of 2020 was a challenging time for all of us, pretty much, right? Due to a global pandemic, but also to the social unrest for some, the inequities shone bright for the first time. Now, for others of us, I mean, this is just what life has just been like for us. Now, generally speaking, Americans vowed to do better, right? You know, everybody said we're going to make changes. We said we're going to do better in our organizations. Now, Pew Research suggests that that enthusiasm continued to wane or started to wane. It started off really high in June of last year. About 2/3 of the adults in the United States said that they support the Black Lives Matter movement. Towards September, that number started to get to just over half of the adults in the United States. And new research shows that that's where the number has kind of steadied. It's kind of just over half of the Americans in the US support the movement. But what did arts organizations do? What was the approach toward equity? That's what we want to talk about tonight with these fine folks. So Linda, we're going to kick it off with you. And the first question is, I got to go back, you know, pre-2020, right? So pre-Tony McDade losing their life, pre-Breonna Taylor losing her life, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the list goes on. What were some of the conversations around equity that you and your colleagues locally and across the country were having around museums and around the culture of arts institutions?
Thank you, Mike. That's a great question. I would say at the museum internally, we were already having discussions about equity and diversity, especially in terms of the collection and the works of art that we were acquiring and the artists we were representing, as well as exhibitions. And we were also kind of developing, you know, a 5-year strategic plan that had a lot of diversity and equity goals in that plan related to staffing, to the board of trustees, to volunteers and docents. And I think all of those conversations were happening. And I think, you know, big efforts were being made, especially in terms of collection development and exhibition representation. But I think the summer of 2020 accelerated a lot of those conversations. And also, I think it spurred things on that, you know, there had been like, oh, we should do this, we should do that, but it actually made us do things. So during the summer of 2020, because of a staff kind of need and request, we developed an internal kind of task force made up of staff who volunteered to be on it, that focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And then we also had outside consultants who were brought in for diversity, equity, and inclusion training for the staff and the board of trustees, the volunteers, and the docents. And as I said, all those things were kind of being discussed, but not actually set in motion until the summer of 2020.
Marshall, speak to this in terms of your work. I mean, the Nasher, kind of similar to what Linda described. I'm sure these things are constantly talked about, but take us inside some of those conversations. Let's go back 5 years. I mean, if you remember the July 4th weekend of 2016, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling lost their lives to police violence also. So speak to when you sort of began to really try to wrap your mind around this and some of the things that needed to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I would say, you know, I joined the Nasher in 2014, and the institution already had been having these conversations around diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. It had, up until that point, I would say, manifested most publicly in terms of our programming and our collection. And so, you know, when I joined the staff, already we were having those conversations. Since then, you know, 2016 was a bit of again, it was one of those moments in which, you know, I think institutions such as ours were able to take a look at what was going on. So, I mean, you know, a lot of the things that Linda just mentioned that NCMA is doing, we have also been doing, just like she said, it was a moment which sort of 2020 was this culminating moment for so many institutions. Our professional organization as well, the Association of Art Museum Curators, has for a number of years now been directing some DEI initiatives within its ranks in order to bolster as best they can the profession itself. So yeah, I mean, I would say that 2016 was the eve of when we presented the Nina Chanel Abney exhibition. And, this is an artist who deals very explicitly with violence, against people of color and very serious equity, issues of equity within society. So it was a moment in which we could, explore those and use that as a platform to have some discussions, to further those discussions.
Yeah, Janelle, I want to come to you because, Black folks, we've been having these conversations for a long time. We just go all the way back to, we can start with Ida B. Wells if we really wanted to, and even before that. But if you think about Du Bois's exhibition at the Paris Exhibition 1900, Negro Art Week in Chicago 1927, and then the late 60s, early 70s, what Black artists and curators and creatives were trying to do, we've been having these conversations. So in your work and when all this stuff is going on, what were the dialogues you were having with institutions about, okay, we've had the conversations, now we got to get into some action, we got to do some things. Kind of take us into your world the last few years dealing in equity within the arts.
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting because there are a number of things that I think frame a conversation and also kind of affect the change. One, I think we have to recognize that the art market and the art world was kind of in a different position. And we can talk about art sales, whether they are, if they yield space for equity and diversity, like we can talk about that. But I think it's important to remember that in like 2019, Carrie James Marshall piece sold at Christie's for $18 million, right? So, and I know that we'll talk, I think, in different ways about what equity looks like. But I think there was the conversation that was happening in the art market where Black and brown artists were selling at significant prices. And that, again, has a whole kind of conversation that needs to happen around that. And then cultural institutions that do not sell work, so collecting organizations, I think, had some of those conversations, I think, but it's harder, I would say, to move a museum in a different direction. There is a long history that it takes a long time to kind of shift the minds and hearts of collecting organizations simply because of the way, if we look at the history, the way that they're founded and the way that they function. And I second the idea that there were lots of conversations that were happening. The things that a lot of organizations that I had worked with and talked to that were holding up, I would say, progress were fear. So the fear that while staff were invested in the work, that there's a risk of board members feeling uncomfortable with a change, that audiences and supporters may not necessarily support the initiatives that are happening to bring in other voices and other cultural backgrounds, and specifically Black and brown people of varying, right, cultural backgrounds into museum spaces. So it was a space, I think, where like internally organizations were struggling because, there's the work that had to happen that I think, the events of 2020 and even before then, as you mentioned, were prompting. But how do you get enough people on board to make the commitment? And that was a real struggle depending on the organization for that to happen. And so I think, as my colleagues have said, 2020 was a catalyst that almost forced the hand of some organizations. But because you couldn't avoid it, right? Board members couldn't ignore it. And I think it allows space for bold action. But at the same time, I think, as you mentioned, it's hard to sustain energy to accomplish difficult things. But I have seen a number of organizations really kind of dig in and stick with the commitment. So the idea of having a newly developed strategic plan, a lot of organizations took the time in 2020 to really think about how are we doing the work and be strategic and have committed to making that happen. I've seen a number of organizations really do more collaborative work and outreach. But at the same time, there are others who are still doing the work. So that has been some of my experience working with organizations that are kind of looking in this moment.
I want to get into Lakeshia and Will, and Lakeshia, we'll start with you. I want to get into the concept of board members and leadership being uncomfortable to activate on some of these things. And I want you to speak from the artist perspective about being comfortable of even engaging with organizations. So Lakeshia, you went from an artist to not only an artist, but now a venue owner, right? So talk about what it was like for you to go through that transition and maybe what spurred some of that on.
Yeah, so I took over 311 last July. And so I was personally feeling frustrated with some of the arts organizations. And so it's sort of like the perfect kind of storm for me, whereas I may not have taken this opportunity prior to this. And so I think one of the things that I've kind of been trying to do is make space for more artists of color, because I want to say that this gallery predominantly served a white audience before, and I don't really think that they took any real measures to be inclusive. And so one of the things I've done was just make sure that in my programming, I've made that space. So out of the 9 months, 5 of them have had either artists of color or people with disabilities. So yeah.
I mean, I think definitely having more opportunities, and we saw this. I referenced the work that Alan Locke put out there in the 20s and the early 30s. I mean, to create these spaces for artists to be able to show their work and to talk about that experience. Will, your work, I would argue, is it centers our experience. Literally, I see it in the features and in the way that you use that paintbrush, brother. So talk about your experience in 2020, seeing all the stuff happen with the protests, seeing organizations make statements and things like that, and how that kind of shaped your practice, if you will.
I think last year, I observed, like a lot of us have observed, that institutions, museums and galleries were like clamoring to invite artists to participate in exhibitions, sometimes related to their Black experience. And so I remember getting invitations that I was sort of wary of whether or not to accept. So it was a sort of complicated thing to experience, in that artists look for people to invite them to do things, but during a time of like social unrest and wanting and seeing museums want to invite people to do things, or galleries or organizations in general wanting to invite artists, Black artists, to do things, made me wonder about the sort of real interest, the authentic interest in what I was doing, and that becomes even more complicated in that I'm totally down for doing anything about Black identity and about my experience as a Black man, but I have started to question whether or not the work is valued sort of with that in mind and beyond that. Like, so I got to participate in an Ashland Browning show at the NCMA, Front Burner, a show about painting and highlighting painters from around the state. And so I started sort of like parsing out the difference between like exhibitions that were about race or about Blackness and organizations that wanted to do shows about Black identity or about social unrest, or has some kind of political content with it, and whether or not I guess I looked back to see whether or not I got invitations like that before, which I tended to, but there was just like an uptick in them. And so I was trying to be judicious about which invitations I accepted. And sometimes I would like call on friends or other professionals who maybe knew of the organizations that were doing invitations to see whether or not they were like viable opportunities, or just sort of one-off invitations made by the people that were extending the invitations.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and you and I have talked about this extensively over the years, the longing for acceptance maybe from institutions, and then those invitations aren't there. And then all of a sudden, it seems like it's trending to make these invitations. And that's a tough thing to balance, I would argue, from an artist perspective, but also, Marshall, coming back to you from an organization's perspective too, because we talked about, Linda referenced staffing earlier. And if you look at that study that the Mellon Foundation did, 2018, number of African-American curators, 4%, 12% of senior leadership on these staffs were folks of color. I mean, that is incredibly low. Now, the study says that the numbers increased from the first time they did the study, I think in 2015, but those numbers are still low. So Marshall, with these types of numbers, if staffs aren't diverse, aside from just bringing outside people in, how do organizations have these needed, important, and here's the key word, informed conversations about how to address these things?
Yeah, no, I think, it's challenging. And I would say that, Will, to your point, just exhibiting Black artists is not a panacea. That's not going to solve the issue. This is something that has to be thought of in a comprehensive way. It has to become embedded into the fabric of the institution, right? So just because your programming reflects diversity, that doesn't necessarily mean that the staff is going to reflect that the staff is equipped to even have conversations about that. So it's got to be a top, to bottom, comprehensive approach to this. And, it's got to be baked in. It's got to be baked into the organization. And Janelle, to what you were saying, that usually does not happen overnight with these institutions. I look at this issue through a historic lens because, Mike, as you know, we've been here before. I mean, this seems to happen every generation or so. It happened 20, 25 years ago. It happened in 1969, 1970 on the heels of Harlem on My Mind, which institutions across the country committed to make changes, and then the changes never really materialized. So yeah, I think it's something that has to be baked into the fabric of the institution.
So Linda, bringing you back into this, how do we bake it into the fabric of the institution, right? Like, from top down, from bottom up, how do you do that so that we can see incremental progress over time? Some may argue that we need to see changes overnight, and we can have that discussion another time, but what are a couple of ways that we can bake it into the institutions?
I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, and it's something we have been talking, more and more about at the museum. And like Marshall was saying, in terms of the curatorial field and the profession, that it is not a diverse field at this time. And I think some of that has to start a lot earlier on, that I think there needs to be paid internship programs that start in high school and go into college that encourage people to enter into the field. When I was in college, there were very few paid internships. I think there are even less now, and it's hard to encourage people to even look at it or think about it. But I think, we have to think about the training and the encouragement of bringing more diverse people into the curatorial field and into the other areas of the museum as well. With the Board of Trustees, I think, that is another big challenge, and encouraging the leadership. And because we're a state institution, it's also governed by state government, to really push that across the board whenever there's an open position. And I think at the museum, the other ways we have been thinking about it, not just in terms of staff and the Board of Trustees, but also the volunteers who work at the museum, the docents who give the tours. And, when we start thinking about how can we make the docents who lead these public tours more representative of the community and the populations that are coming into the museum, I think a whole lot of things have to shift in order to encourage people who are not older and retired to become docents. You have to shift museum hours. You have to be open later or have training on the weekends. I think, we have to think really across the board about all of these things. And our education and program staff have made a huge effort at outreach to do programming outside of the museum. And I think that also has been a huge benefit to changing kind of our population and our community.
Janelle, you referenced this earlier. You didn't use this phrase, but I'm going to use it, cultural sort of competency. When dealing with, and Linda just referenced like BOGs and all these layers, right, that most people may not even realize that museums have. There's different kinds of layers, there's different kinds of politics, no pun intended. When you meet those challenges, what's your advice for artists on how to navigate that stuff? Because they are pushing for change. Maybe some, to Linda's point, in institutions might be pushing for change, but then there's this whole nother layer of bureaucracy. Unpack that a little bit for us.
So my response to that is, it's not the artist's responsibility to manage that. It's ours as administrators and organizations to build a space where artists, audiences, staff members who do not look like the population in power, whether that's by race, demographic, like wealth, whatever it is, it's our responsibility to build a space that is I would say beyond culturally competent. I think organizations have to be ready to be advocates for people that they are inviting in. So if you as an organization are not prepared to deal with microaggressions, if you are not prepared to question, challenge, and maybe part ways with people who are part of your organization that do not support this particular mission, then you're not ready, I think, honestly, to work with, diverse audiences. Because what often happens is that we do put the responsibility on the artists to navigate, this space where they can't win, right? If we ask an artist to kind of deal with an environment that is created by a funder, they're not going to win. So how do we as organizations build a framework and be honest with ourselves and do the work that we're prepared for, and then build towards the work that we need to do before we put artists in this space? So that would be my full answer, right? Like, it's not their responsibility. We got to do right in order for them to be comfortable. But for artists, if we want to talk about artists and what they can do, I would say, one, hold your organizations, I think, accountable. And what that looks like is, if you are partnering with an organization, have conversations about things that are challenging you, right? Or that you are aware or challenging to other artists, right? And ask for, expect, look for ways to make change in that. And I think I just honestly and we work with artists at McCall Center. We are artist centered. We're not a collecting organization. So we have people around all the time. And so the things that I've seen that are effective there and in other places, when there's an issue, ask the question, even if it's uncomfortable. I think don't apologize for the question, right? Because it's a question. It's a thing that is prompted by something that is happening. And so we're not going to apologize for that thing. What we're going to do is collaboratively work together or encourage us to work to figure the thing out. Because, you know, when artists leave, they talk, which is important. I think artists should be seen as partners with organizations, and that's critical. And so I think trusting if you, and you know, well, I thank you for bringing up that idea of you are questioning, right, what you should participate in and what you don't. If you as an artist participate in something and trust an organization enough to invest and be a part of that process, I think being fully a part of the process, which in moments might be, you know, asking, challenging, it only brings the organization, I think, further along. Even if it just highlights spaces that people aren't aware that are a challenge in that organization or that space.
Lakeshia, Janelle just used a word that I love, and it's called partnership. In partnership with organizations. As someone who has taken over and runs an organization, like you alluded to it earlier, that's kind of your approach. Y'all have space here. For you as an artist, though, is that reciprocated from institutions, right? Like as you are presenting now and doing different things, what's that experience been like for you?
I don't necessarily think that it's been reciprocated. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I like, I don't know, really try to make the artists that I work with feel like they belong in this space. When I like think about like the receptions and stuff that we've had for like one exhibition in particular, Your Place at the Table, where I bring in artists of color. It was interesting to see how like the audience received the work because they just weren't really like used to seeing it. And I think that like, I guess building the partnerships that way is also helpful. Like it's not just the organizations to the artists, but the organization to the audience. So yeah.
Well, speak to that a little bit. As far you kind of alluded to it earlier, but in terms of value and who are we equal in these relationships with organizations?
Yeah, I think it definitely varies depending on what the project or exhibition is. So I was given the opportunity to curate a show last year at Lump, and I felt like the partnership, I think, was not only between me and Lump as a curator, but a partnership between the other artists that agreed to participate in the exhibition. And so I'd opened up the opportunity for those artists to share with me like their thoughts about like the installation and their preferences around like how the work was installed, and also like kind of help brainstorm many ideas that they thought were interesting related to that show. And I think one important aspect of partnerships that I've realized over the last few years especially is there's negotiation and compromise involved in partnership. So I guess when given an opportunity, it doesn't necessarily mean like, it doesn't automatically mean that now that you've extended this opportunity to me, I get to come in and do whatever I want. And it might be ideal for me at the time. I think like I'm get to go and do everything I want to do. But the idea that once I'm afforded that opportunity or that's extended to me, that there's a conversation that happens, and then you got to be willing to advocate for the things you want and ask for or demand or whatever it is. But it doesn't automatically mean once a partnership is established. And I feel like the way we are defining partnership, I think maybe automatically suggests that it doesn't mean that one of those partners is sort of acquiescing all that power to the other. It's a consideration of like the needs of both parties. And I feel like that's something I've realized changes from place to place, institution to institution, as I've like performed as an artist, but also as an organizer, that it changes depending on who you're working with.
That's interesting. I've had the pleasure of working with you a lot and so many others, and we tend to when we get in partnership, it kind of means that we're going to do the things that we think need to be done. And as I've said to you and Antoine Williams and others, their culture, we're the ones bringing the culture here in this aspect. And so it is a negotiation, but understanding the value is really, really important. I want to share this excerpt from Bridget Cook's book, Exhibiting Blackness. It's a very fascinating book, came out about a decade ago, read it a few years ago. This is what Ms. Cook says in the opening of the book, in the introduction, quote, exhibitions of African-American art in American art museums have been curated through two guiding methodologies: the anthropological approach, which displays the difference of racial Blackness from the elevated norm, and the corrective narrative, which aims to present the work of significant and overlooked African-American artists to a mainstream audience. The former methodology reflects an institution's curiosity concerning the presence of racial otherness, commonly coupled with the desire to perpetuate the superiority of the mainstream white culture through its contrast to Black difference defined as inherently inferior. She continues, the latter methodology was formed out of the necessity to present to present the art of African Americans and correct for its historical absence and misrepresentation in mainstream museums. Marshall, I want you to respond to this and let's unpack this a little bit. Does Cooks have a point?
Yeah, Mike, I'm so glad that you asked me about this because I actually teach this book in my class at Duke, History and Theory of Curatorial Practice. And we look specifically at curatorial methodologies and the history of exhibition making. And we begin in the 1960s, in the mid 1960s, and go through a whole series of exhibitions in the late 60s and early 70s that Cooks specifically looks at in her book. And I would say that, again, looking at this through a historical lens, the latter methodology that she's talking about is best epitomized by David Driscoll's 2 Centuries of Black American Art, 1976. It was a canon changing, paradigm shifting exhibition. And not that it was without precedence. I mean, because Romare Bearden did a survey of Black American art prior to that. It didn't have a major catalog, so it didn't get the press. But David Driscoll's show traveled across the country, and it basically blew the canon wide open, to be changed. And it took that force in order to sort of make that shift. Of course, it was also on the heels of Harlem on My Mind and contemporary Black artists at the Whitney Museum in 69 and 70, both of which were protested by the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition. So it was a sort of confluence of forces that were happening in the early 70s, early and mid 70s that helped sort of start this conversation and force these changes. Slow though they may have been, they were started back then.
So Janelle, piggyback on that though, because Marshall makes a good point. What Driscoll did blew the cannon wide open, but what did we do with it though since then? Like what have we done with that information? And to your point earlier, Marshall, a generation and a half later, we're having some of the same conversations. So Janelle, piggyback on that.
I mean, it's interesting that, there's been, Marshall referenced this idea of cycles, because I think that we see that also in the way that organizations might approach exhibiting or talking about, in this particular case, Black art. And there are lots of artists who are Black who will say that generally organizations will come and have a conversation about an exhibition in February. And maybe if there's like another kind of special topic thing or something that's happening, like the increase in exhibitions around Black identity and culture post any kind of trauma, right, in the country. And, unfortunately, I think that excerpt remains true on a broad scale, right? There are definitely exceptions to this rule, but there still is this legacy of, exhibitions around African-American art and culture, like being this anthropological kind of exploration, but kind of framed in a very kind of contemporary like way. Or it is filling in the gaps. And while I think historically, like organizations have seen benefits in both. Those are two kind of distal ends of like, I think a framework. And what happens is that artists never are just, however you like, some artists want to identify as a Black artist, some artists don't, right? And we, again, this is like a super complicated conversation that's happening in a short amount of time. But the challenge with those frameworks is it never inserts artists just in the framework of contemporary or any name period here artwork, right? They're always separate from. And anytime anyone is separate from in any kind of context, it makes them, it signals, I think, to audience that they are different, and therefore they can never be completely included, right, in the conversation or in the dynamic. And it creates this space of otherness, right? So we continue to other people in the practice so that we fall back to, in these special moments or when these things happen, then we can talk to artists. But when you ask the question about profession, all of that then affects profession. If we're only talking about Black artists in these two ways, how would there ever be space for Black curators to be a part of an organization on an ongoing basis, right? Because those are special moments. And the same for artists in their careers. If they're relegated to these two frameworks, there's never a way to generate kind of longevity or like build their career to to a space where some other artists have kind of achieved. And so I think that as organizations being committed to this work, that framework has to change. And we see it changing in some organizations, but I think across the board, if there's going to be real impact, we got to get away from that.
Hey, Will, I want you to respond to the excerpt, but in the context of something Janelle just said. When we are exhibited ourselves outside of sort of the mainstream, it's this idea of otherness. I want to unpack that a little bit more, because would you say that there's a need to do that sometimes to get these folks to pay attention, so then we can all come back together, as they might say? Respond to that excerpt in the context of what Janelle just said about otherness.
I think those the two approaches that I mentioned makes me think about like the third approach. I think what I'm extrapolating from what Janelle is describing, where artists are included in exhibitions, or their work is framed or highlighted in a way that doesn't other them. So whether that's in the exhibition of all Black artists, where we're talking about that work in a different context, that I guess in whatever attempts we can make to not do that othering, even if it is an exhibition of all Black art. So it makes me think about like the themes, the content behind what artists are making work about. So I guess I feel like there's an added challenge. It'd be interesting to like have this conversation amongst Black artists about like what are the things that the subjects that we're broaching in the artwork sort of end up sort of falling victim to that, to either of those approaches, whether it's like putting you in an exhibition that's just because it's like an attempt to group all the Black artists together, or to separate it from the mainstream art. Like there's like, it seems like there's the pitfall is also figuring out the expanses and nuances of what Black artists make work about, that I think both the dominant or mainstream audience, mainstream administrators maybe have difficulty figuring out, but also Black artists may end up going down a path that makes it easier to box them in, box us in. It's something that I guess that's what the excerpt makes me think about. That's what Janelle's comments makes me consider, is like, how do we end up caught up in this loop because our art is so wrapped up in our identity that it makes it the new challenge is figuring out what parts of our identity are we talking about when it comes to framing any one of these exhibitions or projects that we see manifest in museums and galleries.
This is such an interesting piece of this conversation. Lakeshia, can you jump in here? Because if artists are presenting work about their identity and in relationship to like what's happening in the streets with the people, you might have a show that is just that group of people presenting the work. And to this idea of otherness, this is that's a fascinating way to look at it, as Will just kind of took us down the road. So jump in here and speak to it, and then we'll come back to Janelle really quickly.
I think, so what that made me think of was Jack Whitton, and how he was like an abstract artist, and how he felt like, yes, he's a Black artist, but whether or not he was making Black art. I mean, I think that might be where it needs to go, to a point where Black art is just art. It's like, I don't know. It's kind of hard to separate your identity from the art, but I think that's really what the institutions have to work towards, by including more art by artists of color, and sort of breaking down that barrier of it being other by it always being present.
Yeah, Janelle, jump back in here.
I think for me, the idea is we've all gone and seen portrait exhibitions at organizations and museums and spaces. And oftentimes there are, and I think there was statistics about collections and all that, but there are very few artists of color, Indigenous art, right, who are present, Black artists present in that type of exhibition. But all of us have seen like Black portraiture exhibitions, right, that were specifically put together with Black artists or brown artists or Indigenous artists, like insert artist here. And so I think in my comment, like there has to be, in my mind, there has to be both, right? There has to be this building of a broader context and having this like dynamic kind of conversation across, if you're looking at like medium or practice, across practice, because without it, there are voices that are missing. And we're not having a fuller conversation. We're not advancing artists in the way that we say we could or are, and still maintain those, I think, exhibitions and opportunities to write about, look at, and I think dissect and exhibitions that are specifically of like artists of color or other groups, right? Because it's not that, I don't think anybody should ever like shy away from their identity, and you make the work that you want to make and make that statement and do them. But it's our responsibility to build these broader conversations with that work as a part of partnering with artists, so that we, I think, are as we talk about culture and we share culture and we ask these questions, that we're asking them across the board.
Yeah, and Stacy Rexrode, we got to have a part 2 of this discussion just about that. So I'm going ahead in front of the whole world right now, letting you know that we got to have a part 2 about that. I want to get to a couple more things before we wrap here, and one of them is this excerpt from Derek Bell's book Silent Covenants. Now, the context of this book, obviously, as you can see, it's about sort of Brown versus Board of Education. But he says something here in one of the chapters that I find fascinating. And Janelle, I want to get you to respond to this. This is what Derek Bell, pardon my audio issue. This is what Derek Bell says here, quote, throughout the history of civil rights policies, even the most serious injustices suffered by Blacks, including slavery, segregation, and the pattern of murderous violence, have been insufficient standing alone to gain relief from any branch of government. Rather, relief from racial discrimination has only come when policymakers recognize that such relief will provide a clear benefit for the nation or portions of the populace. He continues, this fortuity continues a long history of similar coincidences motivating the advancement or sacrifice of Black interests. Three major examples of what I call interest convergence covenants involve the abolition of slavery in the northern states, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, end quote. Janelle, respond to this in terms of art institutions. Would you say that the changes that arts institutions claim to be making would be in this category of interest convergence covenants like Derek Bell posits here?
So I think it depends, honestly, on the organization. There are some who have and continue to do the work of change in order to, I think, have systematic change across the organization. Others, unfortunately, I think that's a real thing. Again, I go back to Marshall's reference to these cycles that we continue to see. If systemic change was happening kind of a long term, then we would not kind of get back to these moments, right? That very much look and feel like they have in the past. So, I mean, and we have to like recognize, like, if culturally, these organizations are a part of our system. If that is the way that our system functions, of course, you know, we mirror oftentimes the systems that we're in. And so, unfortunately, yes, I think there are these cycles and these, like, this notion that in the worst case scenario, right? The notion that we can't look like we're not doing something, so we have to do something moment, right? Best case scenario, we're building on change intentionally and strategically and long-term and are willing to make the investment. Of course, I think there are organizations in the middle, but I do think that we, as cultural organizations, are struggling with that. And I think we need to change it. I was thinking a whole bunch of other things, right? Because it leads to like, it connects to like the school, like our education, like our practice of like how we're educating people in the field, like all those things, right? And so in a moment, I was like, okay, that it's also kind of daunting, like change it, but we got to do it.
Linda, I want you to jump in on here and respond to this. I think Derek Bell had, to Janelle's point, I think Derek Bell has a point here. It also, though, depends on specific and individual institutions, but jump in here and respond to what Bell is throwing out as a theory here.
Well, I mean, I think you can be really cynical and say that people are not going to change unless they see some benefit in it for them. I feel like, you know, a lot of museums, including ours, have been talking about a lot of these issues for a long time. And like I said, I think last summer accelerated the conversations and also accelerated actual action and decision making. But I think another interesting thing that happened last summer and has continued on is this sense of more public accountability for museums. I think people are paying attention to what you say you're going to do and whether or not you do it. And I think there is much more a feeling of being held accountable for your actions or your non-action. And I think that will make a difference, really.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, the public accountability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Lakeshia, as we get ready to wrap and take questions in the chat, I want to come back to you in terms of this 2019 Williams College study in which researchers surveyed the collections of 18 major United States museums. And Janelle alluded to this, found that 85.4% of the works in the collections were by white artists, 87.4% are by men. African Americans have the lowest share at just 1.2%. So break that down for me in terms of value and worth, again, in terms of being an artist and now in your role as somebody who is in charge of an organization. How do you respond to those statistics?
I don't know. It's like, I don't know. I don't have much.
That's a tough one. But Marshall, jump in here. Obviously, you know, this does not represent every institution, but what are some of those challenges of trying to even out these numbers? Kind of walk us through the process of adding or acquiring a work for a collection.
Well, I mean, it's specific to the institution. You know, I will say that there was a lot of press around what has happened at the Baltimore Museum of Art in the last few years with the deaccessioning of some very high dollar works in order to establish a fund to, you know, acquire works by artists of color, you know, which is great. But at the same time, it's got to be part of a much more comprehensive plan. You know, I think, I mean, you know, Jonell, you were just, you know, starting to sort of talk about education and you know, just reforming the cultural institutions is not going to be a panacea for racial equity in society. I mean, it's got to be found elsewhere beyond the cultural institutions. So, you know, I think museums have a responsibility to, of course, diversify their collections. But again, I think it's got to be part and parcel of the institution. It's got to be, if you're only diversifying your collection, you are not doing the work that you need to do as an institution. So, you know, it's probably sort of the easiest way that an institution can begin to change, because the collection, it's easier to make acquisitions than it is to say make changes within the board or changes within the strategic plan. But it has to be part of a comprehensive plan.
Well, Marshall, I'll stay here with you on that, and then we'll get to these questions in the chat and the Q&A. How do you do that, right? Like we know it's got to be done. We know that it's not just about the collection or even the BOG, that type of thing. How do museums shape that conversation? In Alice Proctor's book that came out last year, I mean, she opens in the intro saying that, you know, museums are these places that we're supposed to all be able to see ourselves and be represented, but yet when we go in, that's not typically what happens. So how do we do that? And then we'll get to these questions in the Q&A in the chat.
I mean, the institution has to find the spaces and the places in which to do this from top to bottom. So, for example, you know, the institutions have to look at the structures of their boards. For example, at the Nasher, we have 3 boards. We have a board of advisors. We have a friends board, which is made up of community members, and we have a faculty advisory board. So all 3 of those are opportunities, right? There are pedagogical opportunities for us. So we have a museum certificate program in which the several members of the staff offer classes in museum theory and practice that can serve as a pipeline for young curators of color coming in and wanting to go to grad school. It's a way in which we can nurture that. So, I mean, every institution is structured slightly differently, but every institution, I think, has a responsibility to find those places where they can make those changes.
Linda, I want to go to a couple questions in the chat, and specifically the one about social media and how social media accounts, and because you mentioned sort of the public accountability, can social media be a way to kind of hold people accountable and sustain that accountability, or is it something that is fleeting, kind of like social media is? I mean, there's so much to look at, there's so much to go through. Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think it gives you immediate feedback in a way you probably never got in the past, like up to the minute feedback. And I think it depends on how you respond to it and how you use it. I think it can be incredibly destructive, and then it can also, have a more positive impact. But I usually leave the social media to our PR people, and I don't get involved in that too much.
Janelle, there's another one in here about, and you referenced this earlier, about how museums are funded. How critical is it to diversify those boards and figure out ways to get to show people that change is important, and if they don't want to change, maybe they can find something else to do.
Yes. So not to be funny, but it really does depend on the organization and where some the funders. No, seriously. So, right, some organizations are funded by wealthy donors primarily. And therefore, wealthy donors have more of an impact on what happens, whether change or not, right? Whether change happens or not. With other organizations that receive city and state funding, there are requirements that what they do is more reflective of community, right? So there is this different level of pressure placed on museums to kind of be more responsive to the people that live in their cities, and like that their audience numbers reflect those percentages. When it comes to the board, so there are some organizations, again, it depends on the amount of work that they want to do. There are some organizations that truly just put some people of color on there as representatives. I mean, right? And they show up and they can say that they're there, but they're not really about that change life. Other organizations are intentional and strategic in thinking about what diversity, equity, and inclusion look like. They've changed their fee structures, right? So generally, if you're on a board, you have to pay a particular amount of support to the organization. Some organizations have changed that now to a meaningful gift. So you define what that is, but by doing that, it creates a sense of equity and allows more people to kind of join. As an artist or someone who is invested, if you're interested in an organization and what their board looks like, I would take a look at it. But I think your board is critical for change. If your board is not diverse, if your board is not invested in that work, your organization will not move forward.
Will, another question in the chat, and Janelle, I laugh because these institutions, money comes from all different places, and so it's incumbent upon us to figure out just who we have on this call. So where's the Office of Raleigh Arts funding from, right? Where's the National's funding from? Where's NCMA's funding from? That helps you sort of figure out a plan of attack, and to how to get them to look at you as equals, as we talked about earlier. Will, I want to ask you, there's a question in the chat about equal representation, right? It can be minimized in years to come after this, what some people often describe as a moment. We know it's not a moment, but people, this is the George Floyd moment, which is not only disrespectful to the Floyd family, but just to people who've been working on these things for generations. How do we keep this plan going long term? How do we keep effecting change long term?
I think it's a good deal of it is paying attention to what's happening in the world outside of the museum. I guess if I think part of the change that we want to have happen in terms of being inclusive is not just the folks that have signed up to be part of like the art world like proper, but if it's like extending out to the community. So there was a mention about like social media and its impact and effect on these issues. I think paying attention to what's happening on social media is something that's could be really useful in terms of pushing us forward, and that I think is so it's fairly democratic, and that anybody can get on and sign on for a Twitter account, Instagram account, Facebook account, or whatever, and what you see represented there. I mean, you might have to sort of dig through to get to the things that are in line with the aims and goals for your institution. But I think a lot of what's represented there is of the people, of like a broader scope, a broader range of people, that other than like the sort of educated populace that, you know, tends to the ideas that tend to circulate in a museum and gallery context, I think are sort of closed, can be closed. And when you have people, staff, and personnel that are looking beyond that, I think that's when you do well to not only pay attention to what's going on right now, but what's going to happen in the future.
Marshall, non-fungible tokens, NFTs. Question in the chat: how do you think these will affect collecting art from Black artists and/or institutions' relationship with Black artists?
I mean, I think that remains to be seen. I'm probably the last person to ask about NFTs because I myself am not completely clear on what they are exactly, but I think it's like Will just said about social media being democratic. I think NFTs are an opportunity for a more democratic kind of way to get work out there. I will say though that I have read that they take up a lot of energy, and NFTs are not necessarily eco-friendly, let's say. So that's what I've read about them.
All right, we got one more, and Lakeshia, this will be for you. I'll just read the question from the chat. I'm thinking about how art criticism and museum text plays a role in this system, and if there's a real problem of overdetermination in writing about Black and brown artists' work. Is that framing doing a disservice to the culture, work audience, and the artists as they continue to push their work?
I think it could be, but I guess it depends on like the organization and like the context for, I guess, the overdetermination. But like, I guess the issue there is determining where that issue is coming from, I guess. Depending on like, I don't know, maybe the way to go about changing that is with the change in staffing within the organizations and having people who are more versed in the culture doing the writing to sort of get around that.
Yeah, Janelle, we're going to take one more, and I want you to close this out with this one. My brother Clarence Hayward on the check-in. How do we hold, and he frames it this way, realistically, how can we hold organizations accountable in terms of all the stuff that we talked about tonight?
So this may or may not answer the question. So one, I think in order to hold an organization accountable, you have to somehow engage with it, right? So like, it's super difficult for me to criticize you if you can't hear me talking like junk, right? Like, you don't know, it's not relevant. But if you are a part of and present in front of the organization, whether that's on social media, whether you attend events and give real life feedback, as a constituent in whatever form, are you asking questions about, this is something that I've seen, or this is what I would like to see? Or, this question about the way that artwork is framed or written about, like, I noticed this, like, these are things that you should probably look at when you're writing about, right? So there has to be some level of presence. And then I would also say, that's for organizations that might not be doing the work at the pace or in the way that you as a consumer of culture would want them to do, right? But for organizations that are, I think it's also important to support those that are doing the work, right? Because, you know, presence counts, money counts, right? So like supporting organizations that are making the change, supporting the artists doing the work that you want to see. You also want to ensure that those organizations not only thrive, but they're often spaces that you as a creative can then step into, right? And build that partnership, you know, that Will was talking about earlier. But you got to be present. Like, we can criticize all day, but if no one is aware that you're saying anything, it's not going to change. So I think that's something that I would encourage people to do.
Thank you for that. I want to close this out before I turn it back over to Stacy. And I referenced Alice Proctor's book earlier. It's called The Whole Picture, the colonial story of the art in our museums and why we need to talk about it. It came out last year. It's a very interesting book. In her introduction, second paragraph, I want to read that for all of us to think about and consider. Quote, "Museums are more than just physical places designed to house collections. Their purpose is to shape identity and memory. They do not and cannot represent complete stories, but the distilled narratives they propose often contain the most treasured and the most contested facets of identity, national or otherwise." I want us to consider that as we all ponder what was shared tonight. Thank you to Linda, Marshall, Janelle, Lakeshia, my brother William Paul Thomas. Consider these things and see where in your life, whether you are an arts admin, whether you are an artist, whether you are someone who just appreciates the arts, see where you can get in and where you can fit in, how you can affect change, if that's something that you're willing to do. Thank you all for engaging with us. Stacy, I'll turn it back over to you.
I just have to say thank you so much to the panel. Thank you so much to Mike. Just fabulous conversation. And I think we have to have a part 2 when we can do this all live and actually sit in a room and have a roundtable discussion and throw things back and forth at one another and invite everybody in the audience to come and just hang out in person and really dig down into those nuances that we just touched on a bit here tonight. Again, thank you all. And for any of the attendees, if you have additional questions, please do send them to me at my email, which was listed in the Zoom invitation. I'd be happy to dig deep on any of these issues. If you have suggestions for Raleigh Arts in ways that we can expand on our efforts and learn and grow, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night, all.